I stepped out of the treatment center that morning with trembling hands, a suitcase full of wrinkled clothes, and a head swimming with hope and fear in equal measure, 90 days sober, emotionally stripped to the studs, rebuilding myself from the inside out. And stupidly, I believed Diana and I still had a shot. I had clung to her voice on our brief phone calls like a dying man clings to a rope over a pit, repeating those hollow words she always whispered, "We're going to be okay. Just focus on getting better." She said them so often I almost believed them. I thought rehab was the hard part, sweating out years of bourbon and bad decisions in a sterile room filled with people clawing their way back to life. But the real detox didn't start until I stepped through the front door of my own house. I remember the exact moment I knew something was off. It wasn't the lack of balloons or a welcome home banner, and it wasn't that my old dog didn't come running like he used to. He passed 6 months before rehab, and I wept harder for that dog than I did at my own father's funeral. No, it was Diana's hug. Or more accurately, the absence of one. She opened the door with a strange, thin-lipped smile, like she was greeting a neighbor who dropped by uninvited. She barely touched my shoulder with her fingers, not even a full embrace, and muttered something about being emotionally drained lately, like my recovery had been some inconvenience she had nobly endured. Meanwhile, my daughter Katie, from my first marriage, who had every right to be skeptical after years of broken promises, practically threw herself into my arms crying, saying, "I'm proud of you, Dad." My own wife just stood there like she was watching strangers reunite at an airport baggage claim. The house looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. You know that eerie moment when a familiar place suddenly doesn't recognize you anymore? That was my kitchen. That was my living room. Hell, that was my wife's face. There was a coffee mug on the counter that wasn't mine, a faint trace of men's cologne in the upstairs bathroom, and a pile of freshly folded laundry in the guest room, my room now, apparently, because she needed space. I'd been sober for less than 5 hours and already I could feel myself slipping, not from temptation, but from the devastating realization that Diana wasn't really waiting for me to come back. She'd already left. Quietly, emotionally, and maybe even physically. I thought beating the bottle would win her back. I was dead wrong. You ever walk into your own home and feel like a guest in it? That's what it was like I was stepping into a carefully curated museum of someone else's life, and I wasn't on the list for the tour. It didn't take a genius to notice that Diana had begun treating me more like a ghost that wandered in from the cold than the man who had once carried her over the threshold. I was 3 weeks out of rehab, clean as a bone, showing up to every AA meeting, helping with chores, cooking meals, doing everything the counselors told us to do to rebuild trust, and yet the more I tried to pull her close, the farther away she drifted. She slept in the guest room, because of my snoring, even though I'd been snoring for 15 years and she used to joke about it being her white noise. Her phone, once abandoned in every corner of the house, now never left her hand, even in the shower, for God's sake, and she suddenly had a full social calendar of mysterious evening volunteer shifts she couldn't really explain but always said I'd just be uncomfortable with. There's a kind of silence that settles in a marriage when someone is hiding something, not the normal quiet after a long day, but a tight, buzzing stillness that fills the air with tension, like a wire stretched to its limit, ready to snap. Every time I tried to bridge that silence, she'd dodge, distract, or dismiss me with some casual cruelty wrapped in just enough civility to make it sting twice as hard. And when I finally gathered enough courage to ask, gently, in the safest tone I could muster, if there was something she wasn't telling me, something I should know, she turned, slow and deliberate, with those dead fish eyes she'd been giving me since I walked back through that door. And she said, "You've put me through hell for years, Paul. Do you have any idea what it's like loving an alcoholic? I gave up everything for you. I deserve peace now." Not once did she say no. Not once did she deny it. The part that killed me wasn't even the potential cheating. It was how easily she weaponized my recovery against me, like my sobriety wasn't a victory but a burden she was tired of pretending to care about. Like I was the inconvenience now, not the guy who fought like hell to get clean for her. And the worst part? A small, broken part of me believed her, because when you've spent years destroying yourself, it's hard not to think maybe you deserve the ruin that follows. But deep down, I knew something else too, that rehab might have saved my life, but it didn't save my marriage. Because my wife wasn't angry. She wasn't tired. She was finished. And it wasn't because I drank. It was because she had already started living her next chapter, and I wasn't in it. They always say your sense of smell gets sharper when you quit drinking, and I used to laugh at that, until I walked into my own kitchen one quiet Tuesday evening and caught a scent so familiar it made the hairs on my neck stand straight up. Wine. Not just wine. A bold, full-bodied red. The kind with a sting in its bouquet and a story in its finish. The kind I used to swirl in my glass for hours before finishing the bottle. At first, I froze like I'd stepped on a live wire, terrified because I knew I hadn't brought that smell into the house. I hadn't even seen alcohol in 3 months, and yet here it was clinging to the air like perfume from an old lover. So I opened the dishwasher out of reflex, and sitting right there on the top rack, brazen as sin, was a single-stemmed glass, stained slightly crimson at the bottom and rimmed with the faintest imprint of lipstick. I asked, soft, careful, like I was petting a snake I didn't want to bite. Diana didn't even look up from her phone. "Oh," she said casually, "that was from yesterday. Linda came over. She had some wine. I didn't think you'd care." She even said it with a little shrug, like it was a missing sock or a cold cup of coffee. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but something deep in my gut started screaming, the kind of primal, undeniable instinct that kicks in when your body knows the truth before your brain can catch up. That night, when she left for one of her evening volunteer events, I went upstairs to fold laundry, something I never used to do. But lately, I've been trying to prove I'm still worth the effort. And that's when I picked up her coat. Her black wool winter coat, freshly worn, with the unmistakable scent of men's cologne soaked into the collar. I haven't worn cologne since the early 2000s, and even then, I stuck to cheap aftershave from the grocery store. This was something different, something expensive, sharp, and meant to impress. That scent hit me like a sucker punch. I held the coat for a long time, staring at it like it might confess. I wanted so badly to be wrong. I wanted to believe Linda drank the wine. I wanted to believe Diana still loved me, not just tolerated me out of obligation or pity or guilt. But that coat said otherwise. That wine glass said otherwise. And worst of all, her eyes, cold, impatient, hollow, said everything I wasn't ready to hear. Still, I put the coat back where I found it. Because I wasn't ready to explode. Because when a man's been lied to for years and finally starts seeing clearly, there's no going back. The call came just after 9 on a Thursday night, one of those raw, sleepless evenings where you feel every breath in your chest like a weight and the walls of your house don't feel like home. Just drywall reminders that you're still alone even when someone else is upstairs. It was my sponsor, Dave, a gruff but kind-hearted guy who used to drink like the world was ending and now teaches Sunday school like he's trying to save it. His voice was tense, sharper than usual, almost apologetic, but not quite. "I don't know if I should be the one telling you this," he said, "but I saw Diana tonight. She was at Louis' with a man." And then, just as I opened my mouth to speak, to deny or defend or dismiss, he cut me off with 5 words that cracked the floor beneath me. It didn't look like business. I sat at the kitchen table for hours that night, staring at nothing, holding her phone like it might bite me. She had forgotten to take it to the bedroom, something she hadn't done in months. But once I opened it, once I got past the passcode she hadn't changed, I saw the name Marcus pop up more times than my own. I didn't have to look long. Their texts were fresh, bold, and nakedly shameless, little messages that started with, "You looked so good tonight," and escalated to things that made my stomach churn and my throat tighten like I was drowning in acid. He called her my girl, and she called him my escape. I read those words 3 times just to be sure, but each time they only got uglier. My escape. That's what I was to her, the prison she escaped from. When I confronted her the next morning, still holding her phone like a live grenade, she didn't even flinch. She just raised one eyebrow and said with a scoff, "You're imagining things again. This is your old paranoia talking." Then she actually had the gall to flip it on me, said that maybe I wanted to believe she was cheating, so I'd have an excuse to spiral, to drink again, to fall apart so I could blame her instead of facing the reality of my broken life. That was her move, always has been. Rewrite the story mid-scene, flip the script, make the hero the villain, and walk away clean. But the problem is, this time, I was clean. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't second-guessing myself. My wife was lying. She had a man. His name was Marcus. And I was finally ready to face the truth. They tell you that forgiveness is part of recovery, that holding on to anger will poison you from the inside out. And for a while, I bought into that like it was gospel. I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, if I could let go of the betrayal, if I could stare it in the face and still choose compassion, then I'd be the better man, the healed man, the version of myself Diana had given up on but could learn to love again. So when she suggested couples therapy, I said yes, not because I believed she was sorry, but because I needed to believe I hadn't been fighting this hard just to let our marriage die in silence. I walked into that therapist's office with hope clenched in both fists, wearing it like armor, and I left with wounds I didn't even know I could still bleed from. Diana sat beside me on that soft gray couch like a woman testifying in court, controlled, poised, eyes brimming with well-timed tears that never quite fell. Instead, she laid out a carefully curated monologue about how she had been neglected, how I had made her feel unloved for years, and how my drinking was the real betrayal. She painted herself as a woman cornered by disappointment, as if cheating was the rational outcome of a lonely heart. She said Marcus made her feel seen, that he listened, that he gave her attention. All I could do was sit there and nod while a trained professional told us to honor each other's truths. Later that night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table like two strangers playing house, her phone buzzed. Once, twice, then again. I didn't even need to ask. I saw his name light up the screen. And when I finally broke and said, "You need to block him. If you want this to work, if there's even a chance, you have to block him," she barely looked up from her salad. She just shook her head and muttered, "I'm not cutting people out of my life just to make you feel secure." That was the moment something snapped inside me, not loud, not violent, just a quiet shatter like glass under a thick rug. I had been trying to build a future with someone who had already moved out emotionally, someone who was just waiting for me to give up so she didn't have to be the villain. And the worst part is, I still hadn't left, because forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone wipe their feet on your soul. It means knowing when to walk away and leave them standing in the mess they made. There are moments in life when time slows to a suffocating crawl, when the air gets heavier with each breath, and you realize you're watching something fall apart that was never really whole to begin with. That's exactly how it felt when Diana got the call about Marcus. I was sitting at the kitchen table, folding the last of the towels because, at that point, I'd started doing things around the house just to feel like I still belonged in it. The phone rang, she answered in the hallway, and within seconds, the sound she made wasn't human. It was a deep, aching, animalistic scream that cracked through the drywall and hit me like a punch to the gut. I rushed toward her, thinking something had happened to her mother or her sister, but all she could sob between breaths was, "He's gone. He's dead. Oh my God, Marcus." And just like that, I knew. She didn't fall apart when I told her I was drinking myself to death. She didn't cry when I begged her to stay through rehab. But now that he was gone, she was shattered. For the next 7 days, I watched her mourn him the way I had always imagined she might mourn me, if I ever slipped and never came back. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She called into work and said she was experiencing a family emergency. She walked around in one of his hoodies, oversized, worn, smelling like expensive cologne and secrets, and clutched it like a grieving widow at a war memorial. I tried talking to her, once, maybe twice, but she wasn't really in the room. Her eyes were glass, her words few, and her energy as cold as the grave she'd be staring at by the end of the week. I asked if she wanted me to go with her to the funeral, and she didn't even respond. She just turned away, as if my voice was static and my presence an inconvenience. She didn't lose her husband that week. She lost her fantasy, her escape hatch, and there wasn't a tear left in her for the life she was still technically part of. What really twisted the knife was the moment she tried to speak at the funeral. I stood at the back, in a shirt she hadn't complimented in years, watching her move down the aisle of that church like a ghost trying to claw her way back to the living. But as she rose and made her way toward the podium, Marcus's mother, a silver-haired woman with tired eyes and a quiet fury in her jaw, gently stood up and blocked her path. She didn't shout. She didn't scold. She just shook her head and said something none of us could hear, but it was enough. Diana stopped, blinked in shock, and turned back to her seat. Even in death, Marcus's family had boundaries, ones Diana wasn't allowed to cross. And in that moment, I realized something that should have been obvious all along. She had bet everything on a man who wasn't even proud to claim her in the end. And now she was mourning more than just him. She was mourning the delusion that there was ever a future beyond the lie. It was raining the day I found it. Not the cinematic kind of rain with violins and closure, but that slow, gray drizzle that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavier than it should. Diana was out, probably pretending to mourn in front of someone who still believed her grief was sacred. I was alone in the house, again, folding the remains of a life I no longer recognized. That's when I went to look for the spare USB drive I'd tucked into the back of her desk drawer months ago, back when I still paid bills from the same computer she used to text him. I didn't find the USB, but I found something else wedged between old receipts and an unopened pack of holiday cards. A folded sheet of printer paper, yellowed slightly at the edge, like it had been read and reread a dozen times, but never meant to be seen. At the top, in her handwriting, was a single word that hit me like a hammer. Marcus. I didn't breathe as I read it. I don't think I could. It wasn't a journal entry or a random page of notes. It was a letter. A full page, printed out goodbye she'd apparently written to him during one of their supposed breaks. It was filled with all the melodramatic lines you'd expect from a woman who convinced herself that forbidden love was more noble than the commitment she'd abandoned. Phrases like, "You're the only one who understands me," and "I wish I had the courage to choose us." But one sentence, one single line, carved itself into my brain with a sharpness I'll never forget. If I didn't have to take care of my husband, we'd be together every day. That wasn't a slip. That wasn't poetic license. That was what she truly believed, that I was a burden, a chore, a leftover responsibility, keeping her from the life she really wanted to live. And suddenly, everything made sense. The distance, the lies, the coldness, the refusal to block him, the tears at his funeral, but not at our therapy. I sat there for what must have been an hour, holding that page like it was radioactive, because in many ways it was. It burned through any remaining illusion I had that maybe, just maybe, she'd come around. That maybe grief had humbled her or guilt had cracked her mask. But the truth was written in ink, clear and brutal. I wasn't her husband. I was her excuse. And once that sank in, something inside me finally snapped, not in rage, not in violence, but in something far more final. I folded the letter, slid it into my own drawer, and said aloud to the empty house, "I'm done." Not because I was broken, but because I finally realized she never deserved the man I became. And now, she was going to learn what it felt like to lose someone who actually stayed. You know that moment in movies when the music swells, the hero squares his shoulders, and you can feel in your gut that he's finally done being the victim? That's where I was. No music, no slow-motion shots, just the deafening quiet of a man who had finally reached the limit of what he could absorb without breaking. I walked into my lawyer's office with a folder under my arm, not full of hope or anger, but evidence. The printed letter, screenshots of texts, calendar entries, even pictures of her clinging to Marcus at a volunteer event. And for the first time in months, maybe even years, I had both. The papers were filed that same day. When I handed Diana her copy, she stared at them like they were written in a foreign language, then looked up at me with eyes wide, hollow, and filled with the dawning realization that I wasn't bluffing. The screaming came next, first the sobbing, then the fury. "You're seriously divorcing me? After everything I did for you," she shrieked, as if betrayal, gaslighting, and mourning another man in front of me had somehow been gifts I failed to appreciate. When I didn't react, when I just stood there silent and calm, she turned venomous. "You'll die alone, Paul. You have nothing without me. You think anyone's going to want you now? A washed-up drunk with no job and no future." And that was the moment I realized how much she'd underestimated me, how much she still thought I was the broken man she left behind months ago. But I wasn't. I had rebuilt myself from rock bottom, and the difference between then and now was simple. I had nothing left to lose. She, on the other hand, had plenty. The screaming came next, first the sobbing, then the fury. "You're seriously divorcing me? After everything I did for you?" She shrieked, as if betrayal, gaslighting, and mourning another man in front of me had somehow been gifts I failed to appreciate. When I didn't react, when I just stood there silent and calm, she turned venomous. "You'll die alone, Paul. You have nothing without me. You think anyone's going to want you now? A washed-up drunk with no job and no future." And that was the moment I realized how much she'd underestimated me, how much she still thought I was the broken man she left behind months ago. But I wasn't. I had rebuilt myself from rock bottom, and the difference between then and now was simple. I had nothing left to lose. She, on the other hand, had plenty. So I did what she never saw coming. I told the truth. But in quiet, deliberate clarity. I met with our church's leadership, the same people she had smiled for on Sundays while lying through her teeth, and gave them a timeline, the texts, the pictures. I just showed them what she had been hiding. Then I contacted her employer, the nonprofit where she worked as a community outreach director, the same one whose code of conduct explicitly prohibited improper relationships that compromise organizational trust. And as the silence around her grew, as friends stopped calling, as whispers replaced invitations, she finally began to understand that this wasn't just a marriage ending. The last thing she said before slamming the door with her suitcase in one hand and venom on her tongue was, "You'll regret this." But regret never showed up, only peace did. After all the smoke cleared, after the lawyers stopped calling and the papers were signed, it was me who stood in the house she thought I'd collapse in without her. She moved in with her sister, the same sister she used to mock for never finding a man, and left behind the life she claimed to have outgrown, the life she had poisoned with lies and whispered text messages. But here's the part she didn't see coming. I loved the silence. I loved the space. I loved waking up to stillness, not suspicion, and finding myself in a home that no longer smelled like betrayal but like fresh coffee and second chances. In the weeks that followed, something incredible started to happen. I began to feel like me again, not the wounded husband or the ashamed alcoholic or the shell of a man begging for scraps of loyalty. I got back to the gym, slowly at first, walking laps until my knees didn't ache and my breathing stopped sounding like regret. I meal prepped. I prayed. I replaced that cursed wedding photo, the one that used to hang above the fireplace like a cruel joke, with a framed painting of a mountain range I'd always wanted to hike but never had the courage to. It reminded me that there were still peaks ahead, still places untouched by the damage she'd done. And maybe the best part? I reconnected with Katie, my daughter from my first marriage, who told me over lunch one day, "You look different now. Stronger. Like Dad again." That meant more than any therapy session ever could. Her name is Lena, the woman I met at AA. We go for walks. We talk about real things, not filtered versions of life meant to impress or manipulate. And every night before bed, when I switch off the lights in this house, my house, I take a deep breath and listen. And I never knew until now how beautiful quiet could be. Diana thought I'd crumble without her. But I didn't just survive. I woke up. And what I see now, in the mirror and in the future, is a man no longer haunted, but finally, gloriously free.